On a hilltop in the Hudson Valley, exactly 25 miles north of Manhattan, stands a gray stone house that has been there for more than a century. No gold, no marble, no display of excess. Just 40 rooms built from weathered stone, quietly overlooking the Hudson River as it curves toward New York. From the outside, it would be easy to mistake this place for the country retreat of a wealthy but private gentleman. But this house once belonged to a man whose name alone, at the beginning of the 20th century, was enough to make presidents uneasy. Adjusted for modern value, his fortune exceeded $400 billion. He controlled nearly 90% of the oil in the United States. Newspapers called him a monster. Political cartoons portrayed his company as an octopus, its tentacles wrapped around railroads, banks, legislatures, and the nation itself. And yet, this man did not build a palace. According to family records, his lawyers warned him that any sign of luxury could be used as evidence against him by the public and by the government. So this house became a different kind of choice. Not a symbol of wealth, but a strategy for survival. What makes the story even harder to explain is this. The family that was once the most hated in America would, just 2 generations later, become associated with names that meant the exact opposite. The United Nations, elite universities, museums that shaped modern art, medical, educational, and conservation efforts that reached hundreds of millions of people around the world. So what happened in between? How did a family synonymous with greed and monopoly manage to rewrite its own legacy? This house is still here, on the hill, silently watching it all. But to understand why it was built this way and why it never wanted to testify, we have to go much further back. Back to a time when this man was just a thin, poor boy, counting every coin, convinced that the world could only be mastered through absolute discipline. If you're drawn to historical stories where power is built, lost, and transformed in ways no one expects, make sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel, because this story is not just about money. It's about how power is created and the price that must be paid to keep it. In 1839, in the small town of Richford, New York, John Davison Rockefeller was born into a house that carried no distinction. His family was not wealthy. There was no land passed down through generations, no inherited capital. But from the very beginning, his life was placed between 2 completely opposing worlds. His father, William Avery Rockefeller, called himself a doctor. In reality, he held no medical degree of any kind. William traveled through rural communities selling patent medicines, claiming they could cure cancer, disease, and fear itself. Locals called him Devil Bill, not out of superstition, but because they knew exactly who they were dealing with. William was a gambler, a con artist, and later a bigamist who maintained a second family under an assumed name in another state. He would disappear for months at a time, leaving his wife and children with no money and no explanation. Sometimes he returned with a little cash. Often, he returned with nothing but debt. But William did more than disappear. He actively taught his son lessons about money. Family accounts recall that William once gave young John a single coin, only to return days later and demand it back with interest. This was not a joke. It was instruction. Money was never free. Money was meant to generate more money, and anyone who failed to understand that would always lose. That was the first lesson. Inside the same house, however, existed an entirely different world. John's mother, Eliza Davison Rockefeller was a deeply devout Baptist. She believed in discipline, thrift, and absolute moral order. In this household, there was no such thing as emotional spending. Eliza required her children to track expenses, to save diligently, and most importantly, to give 10% of every dollar they earned to the church, without exception. That 10% was not charity, it was obligation. To Eliza, money was not a symbol of status, it was a moral test. And those who failed that test, she believed, would eventually collapse. So even as a child, John Rockefeller lived under two opposing forces. From his father, he learned that the world was full of opportunity for those cold enough to seize it. From his mother, he learned that wealth without principle was indistinguishable from moral bankruptcy. No one told him which lesson was right. He was forced to reconcile them on his own. In 1853, the family moved to Cleveland, Ohio. John was just 14 years old. Cleveland was growing rapidly, fueled by railroads, trade, and industry. It was a city where money was beginning to move faster than morality, and to a boy already accustomed to instability, this was not a threat. It was an invitation. From this point on, the lessons learned in that modest house in Richford would no longer remain theoretical. They were about to be tested in the real world. And the real question was not whether John Rockefeller would become wealthy. It was whether, when faced with power, he would resemble the father who taught him to make money at any cost, or the mother who warned him that money, left unchecked, would destroy the very person who possessed it. The answer would not come immediately, but it would begin to reveal itself on the day he earns his very first dollar. September 26, 1855, Cleveland, Ohio. John Davison Rockefeller was 16 years old, thin, plainly dressed, and without a single meaningful connection. For weeks he walked the streets of the city, knocking on one door after another, asking the same question every time. Was there any work available? Most turned him away. Some did not bother to answer. Eventually, a small commission and produce brokerage called Kykuit and Tuttle agreed to hire him as an assistant bookkeeper. The wage was 50 cents a day. Adjusted to modern value, that amount would equal roughly 15 to 16 US dollars. Not enough to be called an income, but enough to begin a habit. Rockefeller called that date Job Day, and he marked it for the rest of his life with greater devotion than his own birthday. His first responsibility was not decision-making, it was record-keeping. Every receipt, every expense, every number entering and leaving the ledger. He checked his calculations twice. He caught small discrepancies others overlooked, not because he was told to, but because the idea of an unchecked number unsettled him. From his very first paycheck, Rockefeller did something that would become a lifelong pattern. He set aside 10%, not to spend, but to give away. Yet, unlike most people, he did not give emotionally. He recorded the donation. Who received it? When? How much? To Rockefeller, charity was not an impulse. It was a line item. His life during these years was intensely frugal. He walked to work to save a few cents in transportation. He brought his own lunch rather than eating out, not because he lacked money, but because he saw no justification for spending on anything that failed to produce lasting value. By the end of his first year of employment, Rockefeller had accumulated enough to make the first investment of his life. He lent money to a nearby farmer. The loan carried interest. The farmer paid on time. Rockefeller recorded the interest and reinvested it. There was no celebration, no excitement, only a quiet conclusion taking shape. Money, if controlled, produces more money. If left uncontrolled, it disappears like water. From this point forward, a formula began to crystallize. Earn methodically. Save relentlessly. Give with discipline, not emotion. Reinvest everything else. This was not ambition. It was order. While most young men his age treated their first job as a temporary step, Rockefeller treated it as a laboratory. Every mistake became data. Every cent became information. But this still does not explain the larger question. Whether a man raised on ledgers, discipline, and absolute control could ever know when to stop. Or whether one day, driven by the same mindset, he would build something so large that no one, not even himself, could control it anymore. The answer would not be found in a bookkeeping ledger. It was waiting for him in an industry just beginning to erupt, one where money, risk, and chaos would collide for the first time. And that was the moment when the story truly began to move into an entirely different scale. The year was 1859. Titusville, Pennsylvania. A former railroad conductor named Edwin Drake drilled into the earth and struck oil. His well produced only about 25 barrels a day. But that moment was enough to ignite one of the most chaotic industrial rushes in American history. Within months, thousands of men poured into the hills of Pennsylvania. They drilled wherever a rig could be set down. No planning. No system, no long-term vision. Oil surged up with nowhere to store it. Wooden barrels overflowed. Crude soaked into the ground and ran into nearby streams. Prices swung violently, from $10 a barrel down to 10 cents, sometimes within days. Fortunes made in one week vanished the next. This was a game for men willing to gamble their futures. Rockefeller watched from a distance, and he did not join them. Not because he lacked money, not because opportunity was scarce, but because he saw what most others did not. The men drilling for oil were carrying all the risk. They spent their savings sinking wells that might produce nothing. And when oil did flow, they had no leverage. They were forced to sell to whoever would buy, at whatever price the market allowed. The money was not in the ground. It was in what happened afterward. Refining crude oil into usable kerosene required equipment, expertise, and disciplined cost control. Moving the product required railroads and waterways. Selling it required consistency and trust. This was not a game of chance. It was a game of systems. Rockefeller made his first decisive move in the oil business. He did not drill. He did not gamble. He chose refining. In 1863, in Cleveland, Ohio, Rockefeller and his partners invested in a small refinery. Cleveland had no oil beneath its soil, but it had something more important. The city sat at the intersection of major railroad lines. Lake Erie opened a cheaper water route to eastern markets. Crude oil from Pennsylvania could be shipped in at low cost, and refined kerosene could be sent farther, faster, and more cheaply. Rockefeller began doing what he did best. He measured. He calculated the cost of every barrel of crude, every hour of labor, every mile of transportation. He compared refineries. He visited competitors not to steal secrets, but to identify waste. Every cost that could be reduced was reduced. Every process that could be brought under internal control was brought inside. While others focused on drilling deeper, Rockefeller dug into operations, and that structure began to create an advantage. Refining offered steadier profits than drilling, not dramatic on any single day, but consistent, predictable, scalable. This is where the story begins to turn. Rockefeller did not chase oil. He positioned himself where every barrel had to pass. And when one man controls the road rather than the destination, the game no longer depends on luck. The question was no longer whether Rockefeller had chosen correctly. It was what would happen to those who stood outside a system designed to win. The answer would arrive soon. Because once an advantage begins to compound, it never remains still. And this decision not to gamble was about to open the door to an entirely new kind of power. The year was 1870, Cleveland, Ohio. After nearly a decade in oil refining, John D. Rockefeller was no longer a cautious observer. He understood the industry well enough to see what was coming next. That year, Standard Oil was formed, not as a reckless gamble, but as the logical next step of a system that had already been carefully engineered. From the beginning, Standard Oil did not operate like a conventional company. Rockefeller was not trying to win individual transactions. He was trying to make other people's transactions irrelevant. Cleveland was home to dozens of independent refineries at the time. Most operated with high costs, thin capital, and complete dependence on the railroads for transportation. Rockefeller approached them not with threats, but with ledgers. He showed them Standard Oil's costs, lower barrel prices, lower shipping rates, lower loss ratios. He did not need to raise his voice. The message was unmistakable. Sell now or continue and lose more slowly. Many chose to sell. Those who did not soon learned why that decision carried a price. Standard Oil began cutting prices in markets where competitors resisted. The price of kerosene was pushed below the production cost of smaller refineries. Losses accumulated week after week, month after month. At the same time, the railroads began to change in ways that were difficult to explain. Companies that shipped large, consistent volumes received lower rates. Smaller firms, unable to guarantee volume, paid more for the same service. This was not unusual in the 19th century. It was standard practice. And Standard Oil knew how to exploit it fully. Rockefeller did not simply buy refineries. He bought the entire operating chain. Barrels were manufactured in-house. Wagons belonged to the company. Warehouses, docks, pipelines, each link was brought under Standard Oil's control. The more links were integrated, the lower the costs fell. The lower the costs fell, the greater the pressure on competitors. By the late 1870s, this was no longer competition between businesses. It was a collision between a closed system and those standing outside it. At the same time, Standard Oil began acquiring another kind of asset: information. In multiple instances, competitors found their expansion plans blocked before they could even be executed. Supply contracts suddenly collapsed. Long-standing partners went silent. Not every detail was documented, but in later court cases, testimony suggested that Standard Oil often knew its rivals' moves in advance. And in an industry where cost determined survival, foreknowledge was a lethal advantage. By 1880, Standard Oil controlled roughly 90% of the oil refining capacity in the United States. The figure was unprecedented in American business history. The press began to react. Political cartoons appeared in major newspapers. Standard Oil was depicted as a giant octopus, its tentacles wrapped around railroads, banks, legislatures, and the economy itself. Rockefeller rarely responded. He did not argue publicly, nor did he apologize. In private conversations, his thinking remained consistent. Competition created waste. Waste increased costs. Higher costs weakened the entire industry. Consolidation, in his view, did not suffocate the market. It made the market function more efficiently. But this is where the story begins to grow dangerous. When a system is designed to eliminate waste, it also eliminates choice. And when choice disappears, the idea of a free market begins to fade. Standard Oil was no longer simply a successful company. It had become a structure of power. And yet this still does not explain the deeper mystery. How could an empire of this scale survive legally in a nation fundamentally hostile to monopolies? Who would have the patience and the resolve to record exactly how this power had been built? The answer would not come from a courtroom. It would come from a woman, carrying the memory of a ruined family, and a determination that did not require her to raise her voice. In 1857, in the oil regions of western Pennsylvania, Ida Minerva Tarbell was born. She did not grow up studying monopoly in theory. She grew up inside its consequences. Her father, Franklin Tarbell, was a craftsman who built wooden tanks for storing crude oil. When the oil boom arrived, he expanded his business, investing in production and storage. For a brief period, the Tarbell family lived securely, even comfortably. Then Standard Oil arrived. Long-standing transportation routes became inexplicably expensive. Former customers stopped buying from independent producers. Prices were pushed below the cost of staying in business. One of Franklin Tarbell's business partners took his own life after being crushed by debt. Franklin himself did not collapse entirely, but he lost nearly everything he had built. Ida Tarbell witnessed this as a young girl, and she never forgot it. She became a teacher, then a writer. She studied in Paris, contributed to American magazines, and quickly earned a reputation for careful, restrained prose, precise, unsentimental, and controlled. In 1894, Tarbell joined McClure's magazine in New York. It was one of the leading publications of a new kind of journalism, built on the belief that facts, if assembled clearly enough, could carry their own force. After the success of her series on Abraham Lincoln and Napoleon, Tarbell was given a larger assignment: Standard Oil. The decision was not impulsive. She spent nearly 2 years investigating. Tarbell read thousands of pages of legal records. She studied congressional hearings and state court proceedings. She interviewed bankrupt refiners, former employees, lawyers, and railroad officials. She was not searching for accusations. She was searching for structure. Her most valuable source came from inside the system itself. Henry H. Rogers, one of Standard Oil's senior executives. Through Mark Twain, a close friend of Rogers, Tarbell was introduced. For reasons that were never fully explained, Rogers agreed to meet with her over many years. Some believed he wanted to shape the narrative. Others suspected fractures within Standard Oil's internal power structure. Whatever his motive, the result was clear. Tarbell gained access to details no journalist before her had ever obtained. In November 1902, the first installment of the History of the Standard Oil Company appeared in McClure's. There was no call for outrage, no theatrical language, only facts, dates, names, contracts, freight rates, decisions repeated with cold precision. The series ran for 19 installments over nearly 2 years. With each chapter, readers saw another piece of the same pattern, not an isolated conspiracy, but a consistent method of operation. Public opinion began to shift, not suddenly, but irreversibly. Standard Oil was no longer viewed as a symbol of industrial progress. It began to be seen as a system designed to eliminate every alternative. Rockefeller refused to respond publicly. He did not sue Tarbell. He did not argue. He did not correct the record. In this context, silence did not protect him. It allowed the facts to continue accumulating. In 1904, the series was published as a book, spanning more than 800 pages. It quickly became required reading for lawmakers, lawyers, and prosecutors. Tarbell did not destroy Standard Oil. She did something more dangerous. She made the public understand it. And once understanding shifted, power could no longer remain still. The question was no longer whether Standard Oil had acted improperly. It was how the state would respond now that public opinion had turned against an empire without precedent. The year was 1906. Washington, D.C. After years of quiet investigation, the United States federal government formally filed suit against Standard Oil under the Sherman Antitrust Act. This was no longer a debate in newspapers. It was a direct confrontation between the state and the largest private empire in American history. The charge was clear. Standard Oil had conspired to restrain competition, eliminate rivals, and control the petroleum market through systematic practices. What Ida Tarbell had documented now appeared inside legal briefs. The case stretched on for years. Hundreds of witnesses were called. Thousands of pages of evidence were brought into the open. Rockefeller had long stepped away from day-to-day management, but he remained the largest shareholder and the symbol of the entire power structure. In 1911, the United States Supreme Court delivered its decision. Standard Oil had violated antitrust law. The empire would be broken apart. The ruling ordered the dissolution of Standard Oil into 34 separate companies. Names that would later become pillars of the global energy industry were born in this moment. Standard Oil of New Jersey, later Exxon. Standard Oil of New York, later Mobil. Standard Oil of California, later Chevron. And dozens of other entities. On paper, centralized power had been dismantled, but one detail never made the headlines. Rockefeller retained ownership stakes in most of the newly formed companies. The percentages varied, but they were widespread. The market reacted almost immediately. Shares of the successor companies rose. Investors realized that the individual parts freed from the legal burden of a massive monopoly were worth more than the former whole. Within 2 years of the ruling, Rockefeller's personal wealth nearly tripled, from roughly $300 million to more than $900 million in contemporary value. Adjusted for today, that sum would equal tens of billions of US dollars. The court had broken centralized control, but it had not destroyed wealth. Something else remained unchanged as well: people. Many of Standard Oil's former executives continued running the successor companies. The same managerial mindset persisted. The same networks of influence endured. Only the legal structure had changed. This was the central paradox of the 1911 decision. The state proved that no empire stood above the law, but it also proved that law could limit power without reversing the outcomes of accumulation. Rockefeller did not protest publicly. He did not complain. Nor did he celebrate. He watched. And while public opinion believed this was the end of an era, for Rockefeller, it was only a phase shift. Because when economic power can no longer exist in one form, it finds another. The question was no longer whether Standard Oil had been dismantled. It was what the Rockefeller family would do next with a fortune of that scale, and whether money, once stripped of its ability to control markets, would be used to control something else instead. The year was 1913, Colorado. As John D. Rockefeller withdrew from direct management, the family's economic power shifted to the next generation. That burden fell on his only son, John D. Rockefeller, Jr. Jr. did not run Standard Oil, but he controlled another asset, less visible, and far more dangerous socially, the Colorado Fuel and Iron Company. It was one of the largest coal and steel operations in the American West. Tens of thousands of miners worked in the mountains of Colorado under conditions far harsher than those in eastern factories. Miners labored 10 to 12 hours a day. Fatal accidents were common. Wages were low. Housing, stores, and even doctors were owned by the company. Workers were not paid entirely in cash. Part of their wages came in scrip, usable only at company-owned stores. Prices there were higher than the open market. Debt became a cycle. By 1913, tension that had been building for years finally broke. Thousands of miners went on strike, demanding safer working conditions, fairer wages, and the right to union representation. The company refused. Striking families were evicted from company housing. With nowhere else to go, they built tent colonies on open land. The largest of them was Ludlow, near the railroad tracks. Colorado winters were unforgiving. Women and children lived in canvas tents, digging pits beneath them for warmth and protection from stray bullets. April 20, 1914. The Colorado National Guard moved into Ludlow. Some of the guardsmen were paid directly with company funds. They brought machine guns. What happened next remains disputed in detail, but not in outcome. The tents caught fire. Gunshots echoed across the camp. By nightfall, more than 20 people were dead. Among them were women and children. Some were shot. Others suffocated underground as the tents above them burned. Images from Ludlow spread across the United States. This was no longer a labor dispute. It was a massacre. Rockefeller Jr. had never set foot in the coal mines. He governed through reports and correspondence. But in the public eye, that distance no longer mattered. Protests erupted outside Rockefeller buildings in New York. Newspapers labeled him the most hated heir in America. For the first time in the Rockefeller story, money was no longer an abstract number. It was tied to human lives. Jr. was summoned to testify before Congress. The questions were no longer about profit, but about responsibility. He stated that he trusted his manager's reports, that he had not ordered gunfire. Those answers did nothing to calm public outrage. This was the moral nadir of the story. Not because Rockefeller Jr. personally committed violence, but because, for the first time, the system of power the family had built revealed its human cost in a way that could not be ignored. Ludlow did not bankrupt the Rockefeller family, but it stripped away the neutrality that money had long provided. And when power loses the protection of silence, it must change shape in order to survive. The question was no longer who was right or wrong in the strike. It was what John D. Rockefeller Jr. would do next to live with that name, and whether a family can ever purchase forgiveness when the price has already been paid in blood. After Ludlow, John D. Rockefeller Jr. had nowhere left to hide. Money could no longer shield him. The silence that had once protected the family now stood as evidence against them. In 1914 and 1915, Junior entered a period of severe emotional collapse, chronic insomnia, rapid weight loss, relentless anxiety. Financial reports were no longer abstract numbers. They were tied to images of women and children burned alive in canvas tents in Colorado. The Rockefeller family understood that the problem was no longer legal. It was a crisis of legitimacy. And this is where the story turns. Junior turned to Ivy Lee, one of the pioneers of modern public relations. Lee did not advise denial. He did not advise deflection. He proposed something entirely different. Appear. Listen. Let yourself be seen. In 1915, Rockefeller Jr. traveled to Colorado for the first time. He met with miners, shared meals with them, listened as they spoke about accidents, wages, and life underground. The press was invited to observe. This was not a spontaneous gesture. It was carefully orchestrated. But that did not make it meaningless. Because at the same time, Junior began to rethink the nature of power itself. If money could no longer directly control markets, then it had to be restructured into something else, something more legitimate, more durable, and far harder to attack. From this moment on, Rockefeller philanthropy entered a new phase, no longer scattered acts of giving, no longer driven by emotion or personal image, but a system. The Rockefeller Foundation had been established in 1913. After Ludlow, it became the family's new center of power. Its mission was not short-term relief. It targeted root causes. Global health became the first priority. The foundation funded large-scale campaigns against hookworm in the American South, later expanding across dozens of countries. Millions were treated. The productivity of entire regions shifted within a single generation. Education became the second pillar. The Rockefeller family funded the expansion of the University of Chicago, transforming a young institution into a world-class research center within decades. The modern research university model spread from there. Art and culture formed the next front. Abby Aldrich Rockefeller, Jr.'s wife, co-founded the Museum of Modern Art in New York. MoMA did more than display art. It shaped the aesthetic language of the 20th century. Conservation entered the strategy as well. Hundreds of thousands of acres were purchased and donated to national parks. Public spaces were carved out of private wealth, and after the Second World War, the family made its most symbolic move. John D. Rockefeller, Jr. purchased land in Manhattan and donated it for the headquarters of the United Nations. Power no longer came from controlling resources. It came from shaping global order. The Rockefeller family did not abandon power. They changed its form. From market dominance to institutional influence. From price control to long-term impact on health, education, and culture. From coercion to legitimacy. Yet this transformation leaves one unresolved question. Was this genuine atonement? Or simply a more sophisticated way for an empire to survive after its original form had collapsed? The answer does not lie within the foundations. It lies in what the family built for itself on a hill overlooking the Hudson River. And that is where the story moves toward its final chapter. High on a hill overlooking the Hudson Valley, Kykuit still stands, unadorned, silent. Yet it has seen everything. 4 generations of the Rockefeller family passed through this house. Each carried a different form of power. For John D. Rockefeller Sr., Kykuit was a place of accumulation, a vantage point, distant enough to observe markets, politics, and the invisible forces pulling a rapidly industrializing America. Here, Power was measured in systems, in costs, in the ability to control the flow of resources. For John D. Rockefeller Jr., Kykuit became a place of retreat, not to escape, but to reorganize. After Ludlow, these walls witnessed a quiet shift from controlling markets to seeking legitimacy. Money did not disappear, it changed roles. With the next generation, under Nelson Rockefeller, Kykuit took on yet another meaning. Power moved beyond economics and philanthropy into culture and politics, modern art, mass media, New York and Washington. Influence expanded not through coercion, but by shaping how society thought, saw, and believed. Eventually, Kykuit opened its doors to the public. Rooms once sealed became accessible. Walls that once protected power turned into galleries of memory. The house no longer belonged to a family. It became a witness to a familiar historical cycle. Accumulation, collapse, atonement, and legacy. Kykuit does not tell this story to declare who was right or wrong. It simply holds up a mirror. Power rarely disappears. It changes shape. And every era must decide which shape it is willing to accept. From this hill, they once looked out over all of America, and in the end, were forced to look back at themselves. If you want to go deeper into the stories behind great estates, powerful families, and the ways influence is built, broken, and reborn over time, the videos now on your screen open paths this story has only begun to trace. Thank you for staying until the final moment. If this story gave you something to think about, leave a like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments. Until the next story.